In this video, we'll look at the brainstem. Now, before we get right into the brainstem, let's sort of give ourselves an overview as to some of the structures we've seen, and so we can kind of put the brainstem into context as to its location. Now, here's some of the things we've seen before. We can actually see this is the corpus callosum, and once again, this is a mid-sagittal section. Now, remember that corpus callosum was involved in white fiber tracts going from one hemisphere to the next. Deep within here, we can see the one of the thalmi, the thalamus in there. And remember, it's a paired structure, and since this is a mid-sagittal section, we're not cutting through the thalamus, we're looking through that space to where the thalamus is on the right side of the body. The hypothalamus, the infundibulum, and the pituitary down here. And of course, we have the cerebellum with the arbor vitae, which are the white matter tracts. And remember, cerebellum, we have that thin gray layer up here. And also remember that we have those peduncles, which are basically fiber connections. And there's 3 sets of them, 3 pairs. And that's about taking information into the cerebellum for processing and exporting the information. Now let's talk about the brainstem. So the brainstem is one of the oldest parts of the brain, and it's made of 3 parts: the midbrain, the pons, and we can see the pons here, it bulges out, and the medulla. And the medulla is this portion, and the medulla ends at the level of the foramen magnum where the spinal cord begins. Now let's just talk some generalities. Think about it. Think about its position is that the brainstem, a lot of sensory information is traveling into the brainstem up to places like the hypothalamus, which from where it'll be distributed to the appropriate place. Also, a lot of information is coming down through the brainstem to head out in terms of motor activity to control muscles and glands. The other thing that we have here in the brainstem is that we have a number of nuclei that are buried within here. And these nuclei control a lot of homeostatic things, such as heart rate, the diameter of blood vessels, respiratory rate, how deeply you breathe. So there's a lot of these really basic nuclei that are controlling some of the most vital things to keep you alive. We also see that there's nuclei for the cranial nerves. Many of the cranial nerves have their nuclei scattered throughout here. We also have some other things, such as a reticular formation, which isn't just one structure, it's a series of nuclei that work together for certain functions. So there's a lot going on in the brainstem. So if you want to think about it, it's a lot of homeostasis, a lot of sensory information coming in, a lot of motor information going out. Many of the cranial nerves have their nuclei here. So it's a very, very busy place. Let's back up and to the first slide now that we have that overview. So really the brainstem is one of the oldest parts of the brain, and it's absolutely required for your survival. Damage to the brainstem is extremely serious because it does basic homeostatic functions: heart rate, breathing rhythms, the vasodilation, vasomotion, what we call that whole thing, dilation and constriction. Many reflexes have their roots here. Movement, sensation, maintaining alertness, all is here. And of course, we saw where it is. It's located, its location. Now, here it is on a actual cadaver brain, and once again, this is the area we're looking at, and it's midbrain, pons, medulla. So let's start talking about the brainstem, and it's, as I said, it's divided into 3 parts. The most superior aspect is the midbrain. The middle bit are the pons, and the most inferior bit is the medulla oblongata. And what we have here, well there's things like fibers from the cerebellum and related nuclei travel through parts of the brainstem, because think about where the cerebellum is. It's right there at the brainstem. And we have those peduncles, which bring information in and out of the cerebellum. And they synapse with nuclei in the brainstem and then head off to other destinations, either in the cerebral cortex or to the spinal cord. So we have those group of fibers that are going from brainstem to cerebellum, cerebellum back. We also have other bits and pieces. And as I said, we have the nuclei of something called the reticular formation. And I just quickly mentioned that a bit before. Reticular formation is not just one structure, it's scattered nuclei. So it's a group of connected nuclei scattered throughout the brainstem that function in things such as regulation of respiration, blood pressure, your sleep-wake cycle, pain perception, and consciousness. So it's a very diverse group of nuclei in terms of their anatomical location, but also they do quite a wide-ranging list of tasks. We also have, as I said when we first started, we have a lot of fibers that are traveling through this area. So we have tracks of white matter between the spinal cord and brain, and really nearly all pathways from the brain and the spinal cord travel through the brainstem. And we also have the cranial nerve nuclei that are here. So not every cranial nerve, but many of them are located in this region. And they originate in the brainstem, and the nuclei many have sensory, motor, or autonomic responsibilities. Depends on which nuclei and which cranial nerve you are looking at. And here's sort of an overview. You can see everything. You can see here's sort of a overview of the brain, and you can see we remove the cerebral hemisphere so you can actually look at these structures. And this is the view. So we're looking from an anterior view, and that's what we're looking at here. And you can see here some of the structures we're going to come across. Is that we have the medulla oblongata is here. We have the pons in this region, and we have the midbrain right here. And of course, sitting up here is a diencephalon, which we had talked about in previous videos. Now, if we start to go over here, we can start to see more details of some of the things we're going to come across. This is the crus cerebri. You can see it's the connections between the basically the midbrain attaching onto the diencephalon. We have an area called the substantia nigra, a very important area that's buried within here. And it has a big role in terms of Parkinson's, and we'll touch on that. And something called the red nuclei. And then we have cranial nerve nuclei scattered throughout here. We also have the cerebellar peduncles, and remember the peduncles are the connections between the brainstem and the cerebellum. And then also when we get down into the medulla oblongata, I know there's a lot of names here, we start to see some nuclei like the inferior olivary nucleus, the nucleus of the gracilis, nucleus of the cuneatus. This is going to make more sense when we start talking about spinal cord tracts. These are nuclei for sensory tracts that are coming up. They're synapsing here and then moving further up. So this is where the fibers are actually synapsing. And so their nuclei are there, and these are sensory fibers that are traveling up, and we'll talk about what they carry. There's ridges that you can see on here. You can sort of little bulging ridges. That's part of something called the pyramids, and also we have corticospinal tract, which is also located here. And once again, we'll talk about that when we get to the spinal cord. So let's have a look at a posterior view. So we're looking at the opposite side to what we just saw here. And just want to point out some things. Once again, diencephalon, there's the midbrain, here's the pons, and here's the medulla. And a couple of features that we can see on this side are the colliculi, the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. You can see these paired, double paired structures here. Now, once again, I know I've said it on a number of videos, but make sure that you do watch those 3D anatomy videos on our website from YouTube. They will really walk you through and give you a much better perspective than a two-dimensional diagram can. Okay. So let's talk a bit about the midbrain. So yes, it's inferior to the diencephalon. It surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, which is a little passageway that connects the third and fourth ventricles. We will be talking about the ventricles. Also known as the mesencephalon, part of that area. Now, as I pointed out, you have things called the superior and inferior colliculi, and those are those protrusions we see coming from the posterior aspect of the brain. And they're two paired projections and they form the roof of the midbrain, and the roof of the midbrain takes on a new name called the tectum. Once again, watch the 3D anatomy video, you'll get a much better sense. What's here? This has a role in terms of visual and auditory functions, respectively, and it projects up to the thalamus. We also have descending tracts, which are the part of the crus cerebri. These are white matter tracts, originate in the cerebrum and form the anterior-most portion of the midbrain. Also, as I pointed out, we have something called the substantia nigra. Now, substantia nigra is really an important area clinically because of Parkinson's. And it's posterior to the crus cerebri. And it's darkly pigmented, and because of some of the material that's in there. And not surprising, these neurons in the substantia nigra, they work with the basal nuclei to help control motion. And certainly in Parkinson's, this is where we start to see cell loss in the substantia nigra. And one of the main neurotransmitters, dopamine in the brain, is produced here. And it has a role in controlling unwanted motions. And of course, we see that reflected in a person with Parkinson's when they have damage to the substantia nigra. The red nucleus is also here, and it's posterior to the substantia nigra. And it communicates with the cerebellum. Also the spinal cord and other regions. And it has a role in regulating movement. Okay, there are also a number of cranial nerve nuclei in the midbrain. And we also have the midbrain tegmentum. And the tegmentum is the region of the midbrain between the cerebral aqueducts and the substantia nigra. And what do we find here? We find a lot of nuclei. Okay? And many of these nuclei are part of that system that we've talked about called the reticular formation. We also have ascending and descending fiber tracts, so the white fiber tracts are also passing through this region. So there's a lot going on in very little space. Now as we get down to the pons, the prominent anterior surface contains these descending motor tracts from the crus cerebri, and some pass through the pons on the way to the spinal cord. So the pons, once again, stuff's moving through it. Other tracts enter the cerebellum from here by the way of the middle cerebellar peduncles. So here we have the pons, which is receiving information from higher up, passing through it, most of it on the way to the spinal cord and out to the peripheral nervous system. The pons are connected via the peduncles, some of the peduncles to the cerebellum. So there's exchange of information between the pons and cerebellum to the pons. And not surprisingly, parts of the reticular formation are also here. Remember that reticular formation is really a diverse, widely spread arrangement of things like nuclei that are working for a common purpose. So parts of the reticular formation are here. And we also see some of the cranial nerve nuclei are here, and they tend to be posterior to the tracts. Now the pons, we have the pontine tegmentum, and it's surrounded by the middle cerebellar peduncles. And what do some of these pontine nuclei do? Pontine refers to that they're in the pons. What do they do? Well, they help to regulate movement, breathing, reflexes, and have some role in sleep and arousal. Not surprising, damage to the brainstem may result in things like comas, etc. And then we get into the medulla oblongata. It's the most inferior structure in the brainstem, and as I said before, it really is a bit of a transition between the spinal cord and the higher brain centers. So on the anterior surface, we have these things called pyramids. They're basically these elongated enlargements that we see. And they contain upper motor neurons. Remember when we're looking at descending motor tracts, there are two neurons. The upper motor neurons, which then synapse with the lower motor neurons further down. So these are a collection of upper motor nerve fibers that become part of something called the cortical spinal tract, and it's also called the pyramidal tract. And they're traveling from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord, and they're basically, they almost look like baseball bat sort of shaped things on the surface. Now, the medulla oblongata. This is one place where we can have fibers from the corticospinal tract. They decussate. Decussate means they cross over. You remember ipsilateral, contralateral concept. And they decussate within these pyramidal regions. And motor fibers originating on the right side of the cerebral cortex descend from there on down the left side of the spinal cord and vice versa. In the medulla oblongata, we also have the posterior columns, and these are tracts of white matter on the medulla's posterior surface, and they carry sensory information from the spinal cord to the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. And I know these are a lot of terms, but these two terms are going to make more sense because these are basically the nuclei associated with sensory fibers that are traveling up to the brain. And remember, in the nuclei is where they synapse. So they're moving on to a new neuron at that point. Okay, so also in the posterior columns, we also get the decussate within the medulla. There's some decussations, and sensory information from the right side of the spinal cord is processed by the left side of the cerebral cortex and vice versa. The olive, there's an area called the olive, believe it or not, they called it like they saw it. This is lateral to each of the pyramids, and it's a protuberance, and it's something from the inferior olivary nucleus, and receives sensory fibers from the spinal cord and directs them to the cerebellum. Okay, now it's going to take you some time to really get in there and look at the diagrams, watch the videos, read the textbook, and really get the sense of where these structures are in relationship to each other and what their basic functions are. And not surprisingly, there's several cranial nerves, and the reticular formation are also here. You notice this is a common theme, that each three of those levels have some of the cranial nerve nuclei, and also remember the reticular formation is spread throughout most of the brainstem. It's all different separate little centers, but functionally they interact all together. And then there's the diagrams here. So I'm going to leave it up to you to walk through them, because you can see what they've done is they've taken the whole thing, and then what they do is they look at cross section. So you can start to see where some of these things are, like the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. The tectum, okay, and the posterior aspect, that's the cerebral aqueduct. The superior colliculus, you can see it bulging out there. Remember, the superior and inferior colliculus together become part of the tectum. So you got to start thinking about some of these parts are interrelated in terms of their names. And then in terms of the nuclei, it gives you an idea where these nuclei are. Now, I would never give a cross-section like this and ask you to draw it or label it, but you should have an idea of what parts should be in this general area. Okay, so we're going to end it there, and once again, I really encourage you to watch the various videos that have been posted, read your textbook, and you really have to spend a lot of time. This is a challenging part of the course, is trying to put together all these names, all these interconnections, and everything is happening in a very small space. All right, we'll see you in the next video.